I'm going to start. So are we good? I think I'm going to start. We're a small, intimate group. So if you want to come down a little bit, please feel comfortable coming down. But if not, that's fine too. My name is Derek Hyra. I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs, and I've been here for about 10 years. I also direct something called the Metropolitan Policy Center, which does a lot of collaborating with nonprofits in DC to look at development and equitable development patterns. So what I'm going to do today is sort of go over 3 areas of the city that are experiencing a tremendous amount of economic revitalization, and talk to you a little bit about how we've been working with different community groups to try to make sure that that development actually uplifts the lives of low-income people and does not lead to displacement. So that's what I want to do today. And I don't know how many parents we have here, but it is family weekend. And it's good that I cannot believe that AU has so many different events like going on. There's sporting events, there's a concert, there's food events, there's lectures. It's pretty incredible how many different things are happening this weekend. And so this is just one of a series of different lectures that are happening tonight and tomorrow. So again, thanks for being here. And since we're a small group, like, just put your hand up, ask a question, interrupt me. I mean, we have some people here that know me pretty well, and I could go the whole hour, but you don't want me to go the whole hour. You want to ask questions related to what I'm talking about. So at any point in time, please just interrupt. All right. So my work focuses on how do you get resources into underserved areas and do it in a way that minimizes displacement and maximize the life chance of low-income people. I think in the United States, we're pretty good with doing place-based development, but what do? We develop the place and then we just displace, and we push the poverty to other locations. It is very rare that we actually bring resources to low and moderate income communities of color and actually help the people who have been long-term residents of typically these divested spaces. So I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I did work in Harlem, in New York City, in Bronzeville, on the south side of Chicago. I've written a book, The Cappuccino City, about U Street, and I'll be talking about some of that work today here in DC. But I also just completed a book called Roots of the Revolts, which looks at the uprises that we've had since 2014 in the United States. And so I've also done work in Baltimore and in St. Louis and in Ferguson. And you may think that those aren't the meccas of gentrification and equitable development, but there actually is quite a bit of gentrification that has happened in even the cities that are still declining and facing big economic burdens. So just a little bit about myself and what I do, and I'm trained as a sociologist. I'm an ethnographer. So a lot of people in this building learn through database and econometrics and looking at large data sets and surveys. I think that is tremendously valuable. But the work that I do is I go out to communities and I talk to people. I walk the streets. Most of my work is based on interviewing people who are facing displacement dynamics in their communities. So I do qualitative work. And what I do is I propose theories that help the quantitative folks analyze the large data sets. So now, what are we going to do today? So today, I'm briefly going to go over the history and demographic trajectory of Washington, D.C. Some of you probably know this stuff pretty well, but I just want to give a little bit of background because then it sets up for the contemporary analysis and work that I'm going to show in the gentrified areas. We'll talk about some of the contemporary redevelopment patterns that are affecting Washington, D.C. and the opportunities, but also the challenges of that. And then I want us to talk about how do we get to equitable development. And by equitable development, I've kind of already said it, but it is development that uplifts the lives of low-income people. We often do development to generate a larger tax base, to deconcentrate poverty, those are good things and good reasons to do development. but we often don't always get to actually uplifting the lives of low-income people. And it's a challenge that DC has, but it is a challenge that many cities have in the United States and around the world. All right, so Washington, D.C., the home of the nation's capital, filled with all the monuments, right? And we see Congress, the White House, the Washington Monument. There's my son standing there looking at the Washington Monument many years ago. He's a lot bigger now. But, you know, this is sort of the reason that many of our students are here, because they want to be a part of the power structure that is embedded in this city. But we got to know that this city, it's not just all about the monuments, right? It's about the neighborhoods. And the work that I do is really trying to look at the intersection of the power structure, the federal and the local government, and how it affects the neighborhoods that are here in Washington, D.C. So when we think about D.C., we think about it being the nation's capital, but it also is known as Chocolate City. And it's known as Chocolate City because of the demographic trajectory that this city has had. It used to be a white city, but in the 20th century, it became a Black majority city. It was one of the first cities in the United States that had a Black majority, and that happened in 1957. And you can sort of see, if you look at the 50s and 60s and 70s, you see up here sort of the spatial demographic shifts. The areas that are dark are African-American, but you can see we are an incredibly diverse city, but we are a very segregated city. And, you know, but that is changing. And it's changing in that it's no longer a Black majority city. The whites have the largest percent of the population now in 2022. Whites are 46% of the population. African Americans are 45% of the population. And yes, there are other racial and ethnic groups that are here, Asians and Hispanics, but they're a much smaller percent of the population. And this city's history is really about white and Black conflict. Now, that conflict came to a head and a climax in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. When that happened, days after, there were riots in the city. And many people thought that this city was riot-proof because of the military presence that's in the city or just around the city, because of the monuments and everything, that unrest may hit other areas in the U.S., but not the nation's capital. Well, that was not the case after 1968. And so U Street burned, 14th Street Northwest burned, H Street burned. And so the areas that had a high concentration of poverty and a high concentration of African Americans, many of them went up in flames. But these are the sections of the city, and I'm going to get to that, that are now gentrifying, that are now redeveloping. So we're going to talk about some of the areas that once burned, which now are really posh and affluent. But to talk about DC and DC's gentrification trajectory, I just wanted to put this up so you can see the nation, right? And you can see where gentrification is happening across the country. The areas that have the large circles, 51 to 144 census tracts in these cities, gentrified. And by the way, when I say gentrification, what I mean is a low-income area that has an influx of upper-income people and also investments. So it usually has an escalation in the rental price, the price of properties and real estate, commercial values, also the education levels in communities increase. Sometimes there's a racial change, but sometimes there isn't. But most often in the United States, when we talk about gentrification, it is a Black and brown low-income community that's getting an influx of white-controlled capital or whites coming in. And that's the type of gentrification that is affecting Washington, D.C. But anyway, you can see that Washington, D.C. is one of the areas that has one of the big circles. So it has a lot of gentrification that is occurring, or that has occurred from 2000 to 2016, 2013. And that trajectory is still happening today. So you can see here, this is just an assessment of the top gentrified cities in the United States since 2000. and Washington, D.C. ranks number 2. So between 2000 and 2013, over 54% of the low-income census tracts gentrified. That is incredible. So the gentrification is happening all around the city. And here now you can see sort of, we've got a map of DC in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And, DC didn't have a lot of gentrification in the 1990s. Actually, only 5% of the low-income census tracts, and those are the tracts that, you see in blue, dark blue, gentrified. But it totally changed by the 2000s. In 2000s, like I said, over 54% of the low-income census tracts experienced an economic revitalization. And a lot of that is happening all around the downtown. So I'll sort of point, if you can see here, there we go. So this is the Shaw U Street area, so we're going to talk about that. This is the Waterfront here in Southwest. We'll talk about that area next, and then here we'll talk about Navy Yard and Anacostia. And so these are 3 different case studies that I've had the fortune of working with community organizations that are trying to make the economic revitalization happen in these parts of the city be more equitable. A little homage to Marvin Gaye and what's going on. Well, what's going on in Washington? So this is an area in the Shaw U Street. It is just north of U Street and 14th Street. This is 14th and W. I took the picture on your left in 2010, and then the picture on your right in 2014. And I think that having these 2 pictures next to each other really sort of symbolize the type of redevelopment that is happening in Washington. So you've got AM/PM carryout. It's a low-cost soul food carryout for people on the go. You see a lot of people sort of convening outside of this restaurant in 2000. But this area, plot was basically sold to a developer who put in P14. P14 is an upscale bistro that sort of caters to the young white millennials who have moved into the Shaw U Street area. So that's what is sold at P14. You can get a $28 foie gras lobster burger, and it's upscale soul food. And then you can see the young whites who brunch. I don't know. I mean, we got some, families here. We've got some parents here. We got some kids here. Well, the students and the kids know in DC, Sunday and Saturday, it's about brunching. That's what people do in DC. They go out and they brunch and they sit and they drink for 2 to 3 hours and just hang out. Well, P14 is one of those places. But what a transformation, right? From what AMP once was to what P14 now is. Now, the Shaw U Street area was known as the Harlem of Washington, D.C. It had a Black majority for a very long time. In 1980, it was 80% African-American, but by 2010, it was only 30% African-American. African-Americans didn't get completely displaced from this community because there were multifamily buildings like the one you see, 1330. 1330 is a place-based subsidized Section 8, also has low-income housing tax credits that use to keep it affordable. But the 30% of African-Americans, most of them who still live in the Shaw U Street area, live in subsidized housing. And that subsidized housing was built on 7th Street after the uprisings in the unrest of 1968. So there still is a lot of subsidized housing. So when many people think about gentrification, they think about residential displacement. They think about people who once lived in a community getting kicked out because the rents skyrocketed and went up. The rents have gone up quite a bit in this area of the city, but there still is subsidized housing that is there. So when I looked at this area, I wasn't that concerned about the residential displacement, although there's been some. But what I discovered and what I found, there was another type of displacement going on, that even for the people who were able to stay in this neighborhood as it revitalized, they felt like they were being culturally displaced. They felt like they were being politically displaced. And so places like Wanda grew up in Washington, D.C. She's a fourth generation Black Washingtonian. She grew up in public housing. Well, she started a hair shop. Her hair shop was on U Street. The rents rose when the redevelopment happened. So she moved her hair shop over to 7th Street. Well, then 7th Street started to get redeveloped, and Wanda's business for temporarily was displaced. So we got to think about a hair shop, how important that is for a Black community. That's just not a place to get your hair cut. That's to hear about gossip and politics and to convene. But places like hair shops and Black barber shops were being displaced. And so even the low-income residents who were able to stay in 1330 were upset because the places that they went to, that they, would use services, were being displaced from the community. So Dominic Moulton, he heads 1DC, and that's Organizing Neighborhood Equity, which is located very close to where Wanda's hair shop was. And he is reacting to whites who are moving into this community and saying, I'm moving here because of the diversity, because of the rich Black history. And he says, don't tell me that you moved to this neighborhood because you wanted diversity. No, you've moved here because you realize you got the numbers to change the culture. So Wanda's is being displaced. P14 is coming in. The whole area and dynamic of Shaw U Street is changed, and it's changed in a way that many low-income people who are able to stay in place in affordable housing feel out of place in their own community. Well, Dominic hooked up with Wanda and with other people who were low-income up and down 7th Street, and he also worked with AU and the Metropolitan Policy Center, and we worked together on a community benefits agreement. So 1DC struck the first community benefits agreements in Washington, D.C.'s history. They partnered with the developer and the city who initially displaced Wanda's, and they worked with the developer to actually get low, subsidized commercial spaces for historic legacy businesses in Washington, D.C. So Wanda came back, and Wanda is back on 7th Street, and her business is thriving. But she was able to come back because she paid a below market rent in the space that was redeveloped where her business once existed. Wanda has been so successful that she actually bought another business bay in Anacostia, which I'm going to talk about as redeveloping, and she bought it for a very good price. And now when that community redevelops, she's going to get the equity, and she's going to be able to open up the next Wanda's hair shop and the next Wanda's hair shop. So, really 1DC and the organizing work that they did with her really helped to establish her and helped to expand her business. But without that activism, Wanda's shop would be gone. All right, so now let's move over to Southwest and Southeast. We're going to talk about the Wharf. How many people have been to the Wharf and the waterfront? Yeah, it's pretty impressive. So for those of you who haven't been there, we are now sort of, again, let's just look at where we were. We were kind of up here, Shaw U Street. We came down south. We are right here, and then you kind of see where the waterfront is. So now I've situated you into a different part of DC, and now look what's at the waterfront. This is a $3.6 billion investment by 2 real estate developers, and it is amazing. So parents who are here, you're going to hear your kids ask you for some money because they're going to want to hear a concert, and they want to go to the Anthem, and the Anthem Theater is an amazing theater that is at the waterfront. They also might want you to take them out to dinner. Some of the best restaurants in the city are at the waterfront. The waterfront has some of the highest priced properties in all of Washington, D.C. It is very expensive, but it is a total transformation along that waterfront. So it brought in, it upgraded parks. It has over 31 restaurants, piers. It's got hotels. It's really just a tremendous development. But this development just didn't happen because the market wanted it to happen. Of course, the developers wanted it to happen, but they didn't have the capital. And nobody wanted to invest in something that was this large because it was perceived as being too risky. So in order for it to happen, there was public financing. So one, the city worked with Congress because Congress controlled the land. And so the land rights went from the federal government to the local government. Then the local government gave the land to the developer for $1, right? It's kind of incredible. So they got a 99-year land lease on that area that it was redeveloped for $1. It was worth millions of dollars, but the developer got it for $1. Also, there were tax increment financing, and I don't have time to explain that. Let's just say that the developer got even more subsidies from the Washington, D.C. government to provide the 200 million or over 300 million in seed capital to start the development off, which allowed the developers then to go get investors in the country and around the world to undergird this development. So with that public financing, there was a deal cut between the development team, the city, and also community groups who provided input who wanted to see that benefits actually came to low-income people who lived in this area. This area actually has quite a bit of public housing. It's got 3 public housing projects. I have outlined one of them. You can see the dark green leaf. That is a public housing project that has been in this area for a very long time. And so the idea was maybe there would be benefits that come from the wharf for low-income people, or actually maybe there will be some subsidized housing that will actually be at the wharf for low and moderate income people. And the developer agreed to do some affordable housing. But then the Great Recession hit. And the developer went back to the city and said, you remember all these promises I made? You know, the financing isn't really penciling out anymore because it's really difficult during the Great Recession to get this done. So the city sort of said, well, we've already invested, you've invested, don't worry so much about the community benefits. And so there is some affordable housing, but it's a very watered down affordable housing. And then also, no one really asked and said, well, once this development hits, there's going to be spillover effects. It's going to affect the properties that are close to Greenleaf. It might actually affect Greenleaf. And while the wharf was going on, lo and behold, the DC Housing Authority came up with a redevelopment plan for Greenleaf. So the residents thought, oh my goodness, we know what this is about. The redevelopment plan is not to keep us in this space. It is to displace us from this space. So we really need to think about how the wharf and the tax base that it is garnering and bringing into the city may be utilized to help stabilize the low-income people who live in close proximity to this development. So that is Greenleaf right there, and you can see the cranes. So Greenleaf sits in between the wharf, also Nats baseball stadium, and Audi Field, the soccer field. So tremendous amounts of subsidies from the city have gone in to subsidize our sports teams and is bringing a lot of economic development resources, but are those resources spilling down and spilling over to affect and help low-income people? Well, I've interviewed people at Greenleaf and Syfax and James Creek. Those are the 3 public housing projects down there, and they think the writing's on the wall, that the subsidy and the development that is going on there is really going to lead to their eventually displacement. And in 2021 and 22, the Housing Authority said they were going to do build first at Greenleaf, meaning they were going to build subsidized housing first before they built market rate housing. Well, the city went back on that plan because, again, another recession comes in related to the pandemic. The developer made all these promises and said, oh, in the current economic environment, I can't build first. So is it okay if I do the market rate stuff first and we displace some people? And the city said, well, sure. Okay. So again, this city really struggles with figuring out how to do development and do a development in a way that is equitable. All right. So it's not all doom and gloom, you know, just like say. So there's another organization called Southwest DC Action, and the Metropolitan Policy Center has been advising them. And what they are trying to do is get a land trust. They don't think they can fight the housing authority. They don't think they can fight the city on that battle. But what they want to do is get control of some of the vacant properties in Southwest so that they can build affordable housing. And in DC, if you can take out the value of the land is the gold. The land is what is so expensive. A quarter of an acre could go anywhere between 800 and $1 million, right? So if you take that out to build a home for somebody, that could cost 300,000. That could cost 200,000. But you put the land in it, and then it's 1.3, 1.5, 2 million. So a strategy that many of the community groups are really trying to do is to get a hold, just as the developer of the wharf got a huge subsidy for the land. Why can't DC start giving subsidies for land so that affordable housing can be built? And that's what Southwest DC Action is trying to do. All right, last area of the city, and we're looking at the 11th Street Bridge Park project. So this is a bridge that is now going to become a green park. And it is going to, it's going to basically bring people together who've been very divided. DC, I told you, is a very segregated city. The racial dividing line used to be Rock Creek Park, and then it used to be 16th Street, and then it was 7th Street, and then it was North Capitol, and the line keeps moving east. Well, now the line is the river. Wards 7 and 8, which are east of the river, is where areas are 98% African American. So what this bridge is going to do is going to bridge an area, Navy Yard, which is right by Nats Ballpark, which has gone through a tremendous amount of economic revitalization, and it's now majority white. And it will bring people across that bridge to Anacostia, where 98% of the population is African American, and it is the lowest income area of Washington, D.C. So there's sort of an issue about, will this be a Trojan horse? Meaning bringing development, but bringing the type of the development that will likely displace people from Anacostia. It's still to be seen. The bridge is going to cost about $140 million. The person, Scott Kratz, who's been heading this, has done a lot of fundraising, but Washington, D.C., again, has kicked in a lot of subsidies and a lot of investment to make this bridge happen. So this is what's at Navy Yard. This is another place your kids might ask you to come. I take my student staff from Metropolitan Policy Center when we do our retreats. We go to the district winery. That's in Navy Yard. And you can see, you know, the group that hangs out there and goes there. Now, that bridge is going to bring people to Anacostia. And what I'm showing you here is Berry Farm. Berry Farm is a public housing project that was developed in 1941. It is on the east of the Anacostia River, but as the planning was happening for the Bridge Park project, Berry Farms was going down. Berry Farms is down. All the people, and there were 600 families that were in this development, have all been displaced. So, you know, we got subsidies going for certain infrastructure and certain developments, but when there's an opportunity to put resources behind preserving people in place, our city sort of turns a blind eye, says we just can't do it financially. I don't know. I think there probably were opportunities to preserve Berry Farm, but the Berry Farm residents haven't given up. They've linked up with an Empower DC, which is another community organizing group that's in Washington. And even though they've been displaced, they are fighting like crazy to keep a foothold in the redevelopment that happens at Berry Farm. And also Scott Kratz and his 11th Street Bridge Park project, they've raised, you know, almost $100 million for the park, but they also have raised $75 million for their equity plan. They understand that their development is going to stimulate other investors to buying into Anacostia, and they know that that development may actually trigger and stimulate the displacement. So they have started a land trust in Anacostia, and it's also spread to other areas of the city. And the Douglas Community Land Trust is working with the Southwest Land Trust to preserve affordable housing. but we'll see. We will see. But I can tell you that the amount of resources that are going into the bridge versus the amount of resources that are going into affordable housing for the Douglas Land Trust, they aren't equal. And one is much greater than the other. And I don't really need to tell you which one is. You can figure it out. And you think about the 600 families that were lost at Berry Farm, the Douglas Land Trust won't even come close to providing housing, one, that's at the income levels for that displaced population, but also just replacing the number of units. They're not going to get to scale to have another 600 families stay in that community. So we, again, got to think about how we go above and beyond the efforts, and some great efforts that are going on to do equitable development. So I'll leave you with some, thoughts about what we could do to do better. And I think one of the things is we have to preserve viable, affordable housing in the areas that are being redeveloped. I talked about 1330. That could have been redeveloped at a luxury condos or rentals, but there was low-income housing tax credit money that went in to preserve it as affordable housing. But we can see Greenleaf, the writing's on the wall. They likely will have the same fate as Berry Farms residents. But can we actually put some subsidy behind preserving public housing in the areas that are gentrifying in Washington? I think that would be a way that we could make sure the development that is happening actually uplifts and betters the lives of low-income people, if we can keep low-income people in place in the public housing that is in these places. I also think we could put more resources behind the land trust. DC is putting some money behind it, but we need more. But we have to go beyond thinking about residential displacement. I talked to you about in the Shaw U Street area, there was affordable housing, right? There was 1330 and other buildings like it, but the residents that were able to stay talked about political displacement and cultural displacement. So we need to think about preserving the political voice of low-income people in the city. And there are ways we can do that, but also we need to think about not just the political displacement, we got to think about the cultural displacement, and that relates to preserving legacy businesses like Wanda's and having the city give resources that subsidizes not only rental spaces for residents, but also commercial spaces for small businesses. Because if we can keep low-income people in place, we also have to think about keeping their businesses that they frequent and go to, so that they feel like the community is still theirs. Muriel Bowser has put some resources, very minimal. It was like $5 million to help preserve legacy businesses. Part of that $5 million was the equity that Wanda got to open up her shop in Anacostia. We've got to expand the resources in that pot of land. And we need to think about greasing the wheels of social integration. We need to build third spaces when we think about the mistrust, right, in our city and in our nation around race. That when young white millennials who go to AU or GW or any of the schools here go in and move in after they graduate to some of these gentrified areas, there is going to be tension and conflict. And we need to think about third spaces that bring people together, that bridge these differences, so that people can talk about the pain of the past and doing restorative justice, so that in these gentrified spaces that are becoming more mixed income and more racially diverse, there actually is peace and not conflict. We don't do a lot of that here in DC or anywhere in the nation. So I'm going to end and wrap up with this. So here's a picture. I try to throw in pictures of my son. I don't know, I should throw in some pictures with my daughter in it too, but I bring my kids all around the city. And this is the Anacostia Smithsonian Museum, and it's in Anacostia. I would highly recommend that you go. A lot of people go to the Smithsonian's on the mall. Well, there's a Smithsonian in Anacostia. And they did a series called The Right to the City. And it was about all neighborhoods that have changed and gentrified in the city. And it gave this history of these different places. So here's my son looking at it and thinking about, like, who has the right to the city and who is going to be able to stay in the nation's capital as it redevelops. And I just want to say that here at MPC, we don't have all the answers and we don't have all the solutions, but we try to work with people And we try to work with organizations that are embedded in these communities, like One DC, like Empower DC, like Southwest DC Action. And we are working with these groups that are working with vulnerable populations to try to ensure that more resources go to keep people in place so that everybody has a right to this great nation's capital. So with that, I want to say thank you for being here, and I'm happy to take questions. So thank you. Now I'll move the mic around, or I'll move around so I can. Is this on? Check. Yeah, it's on. So any questions about anything I've said? And it doesn't even have to be about my presentation. Ask me a question about DC or AU or whatever you have on your mind. Good. Good question. I don't know that building specifically, but DC has an interesting law called TOPA, and it's the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And what happens with a multifamily building like the one I showed, 1330, if the private developer wants to sell that building, he or she has to give the right to the tenants to purchase the building. Now you probably think like, all right, there's low income people who are making $15,000 to $20,000 a year. They're struggling. How the heck are they going to come up with the equity or the money to buy the building? But they do. Sometimes foundations will give program-related investments for that. Also, there's an affordable housing trust fund that DC has. So another policy that a lot of other cities don't have. $100 million a year goes from the operating budget into this account. And sometimes this money is utilized to give to residents so that they can buy the building. And so it doesn't go market rate. So can residents in affordable buildings do things to help maintain their right to the city? Absolutely. And the TOPA law helps them do it. But the other thing that also happens is with TOPA, usually the residents don't get enough resources to buy the building, but it gives them leverage because they can sell their rights to the developer. And by selling their rights, they can negotiate a deal where there will be a certain number of low and moderate income units in the mixed income building that gets redeveloped. So it gives them political and economic power, even if they can't buy the building. So yes, I think rent strikes can be a good thing. But I will also say this, it is very difficult to do. So when TOPA gets enacted and sometimes residents come together to buy the building, I've seen then all of a sudden the tenants get the rights to the building, but then they realize, oh my goodness, it's kind of hard to maintain a building and their operating costs that happen to, so they got to collect the rents, but they got to collect enough rents that can maintain the building. And that is very difficult to do. The other thing that happens is sometimes low-income people start to understand what the unit is worth. And they become capitalists real quickly. And they're like, oh, maybe we should sue our tenant organization so that we get the right to the unit and then we can sell the unit and make 800,000 and make $1 million. So I think that it can happen, but I just want to let you know that just having tenants strike and also having tenants get the right to own their building, it still is a difficult battle to have it all work out. So good question. Go ahead, in the back. Sure. All right. So the first one was One DC's, and that was with Chip Ellis, who's a Black developer. Is really interesting, you know, to give the full context of that Chip Ellis, fourth generation Black Washingtonian, went to Howard, works for the Clinton administration, and then becomes a real estate developer. And you know, he's doing a development, Progression Place, that's in Shaw U Street on 7th Street, and he's trying to kick out Wanda. And Wanda's a fourth generation Black Washingtonian. And it was just so interesting. So sometimes, you know, we talk a lot about race and the Black-white divide, but we also have to think about class. And class structure and class strife within Black America. And the battle between Wanda and Chip represents that. So anyway, that's one thing. So anyway, Dominic Moulton basically worked with Chip, worked with Wanda, worked with the city. And then like I said, two of the bays got a below market rent for their commercial space for 5 years. Also, in the development that happened, there were like 236 units. A third of them were affordable. That was also part of the community benefits agreement. And then there was a community fund that was about 750,000 that went to different organizations that were in close proximity to the development in the Howard Theater and Progression Place. So those were the three components. It was a community fund, affordable housing, and commercial space at a below market rate for 5 years. The other ones I don't know as well, like there's the Mystics like facility, and that's in Anacostia. When that was developed, that had a community benefits agreement. And then the other one was the community benefits agreement with the wharf. But like I said, that one seemed like it was strong, but it got really watered down. And the other thing about these community benefits agreements is usually they are not legally binding agreements. So it's like a promise that the developer makes or that the city makes, or there's a promise between an advocacy group, the developer, and the city. And things change, right? I mean, the Great Recession, the pandemic, I mean, interest rates fluctuate, the price of capital fluctuates, the price of development fluctuates. So in these deals, the wharf was a 16-year development process. So something that's promised in year 3 of 16 may not come to fruition. So I think the real lesson with the community benefits agreements are, one, can you structure them so they are legally binding? That's one. Two, and if they're not, do you have the political wherewithal to keep developers' feet to the fire throughout the course of development? And that can be really hard for low-income people because low-income people move a lot and they're not always going to be in the same place, or they don't have enough capacity, right, to basically track a development for 16 years to make sure what was promised in year 3 actually happens in year 10. So does that answer some of your question? I went a little bit beyond, sorry. Go ahead. Can you speak up a little bit? Uh-huh. Yeah. Am I right that yes. Yeah. Right. So I'll just kind of repeat the question. Yeah, there wasn't housing. So the question was, Main Avenue is the street that is just north of the wharf. It's like basically the entrance to the wharf is Main Avenue. And the question was, what was there before? Well, I know there used to be Oxygen, which was a dance club, was there. Phillips Crab Place was there. There were a couple of establishments. Also, there were people that lived in the boats, and there are still people that live in the boats that are on the water there. Some of those people got kicked out, but there wasn't a lot of affordable housing at the wharf. And I try to be pretty clear. There was some business displacement that occurred, but it wasn't a thriving area by any means. So there wasn't a lot of displacement actually on the site where you now have all the restaurants and the hotels. But I think what was the failed opportunity for the city was, I didn't think the city really thought through the spillover effect. They just said, oh, well, we're not displacing anybody from right here, so we're okay. But Greenleaf, Syfax, the public housing projects are being affected by the development. There's spillover effects. And there wasn't a lot of thought given to, even though there wasn't direct displacement on the site of the wharf, that the wharf was going to stimulate something in Southwest that eventually would displace people. So it's sort of an indirect displacement, and that should have been front and center, I think, in that plan. And it wasn't. Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you guys read the Washington Post today, but there was a story about the DC Housing Authority and the DC Department of Housing and how they are mismanaging the Section 8 voucher program. There's like 3,100 Section 8 vouchers that were approved that actually haven't gone to people because of mismanagement. And so the DC Housing Authority has had a lot of problems. And those problems came to light in the Washington Post, but basically HUD did a review of the DC Housing Authority, and it has a tremendous amount of units that are in disrepair and that are also vacant, but it has a huge waiting list of people who are trying to get on it. And so people are like, well, I don't know if we can trust the housing authority to do real development. But the thing is that the housing authority controls a lot of land. That I told you, the land is the gold. So the housing authority is rich. They just have to figure out how to tap into the equity and tap into the land value to then get enough resources to make the units viable and whole and livable. They also have to figure out how to manage their Section 8 voucher program. That's another part. I didn't talk a lot about Section 8. That's okay. But there are management issues with the DC Housing Authority. But some cities, they don't have the gold. They don't have the land. They have the land, but it's not worth that much. This area is very wealthy. The land is always in demand. It's just figuring out how to manage it appropriately. And so I think that there's the opportunity for the DC Housing Authority. They get the right people in. By the way, they just fired their executive director. A new executive director came from Alexandria's Housing Authority and now is going to work the DC Housing Authority. I hope that he figures out how to manage that authority better so that it actually can preserve Greenleaf and Syfax and these other places. But what I'm saying is in some cities, the resources aren't there. There's just not enough money. That's not the case in Washington, D.C. The housing authority is being mismanaged, but also some of its politics. Do you think any real estate developer wants Greenleaf to stay, or do they want to get that land to redevelop it to make money? So it's not just mismanagement, it's a political battle. Who appoints all of the board, the board of directors of the housing authority? Well, the majority is the mayor. Where does the mayor get most of her money? From real estate developers. So when you ask, why isn't the housing authority doing more? And I'm telling you they're mismanaging things. Well, maybe that's a purposeful mismanagement so that developers can claim, look how bad this is being managed. I should get it. I should do mixed income. And maybe I'm going to then build some low income housing for some of the residents, but I'm going to have to displace some of the other ones because the numbers don't pencil out. So, but anyway, all is to say is it's politically difficult to do, to have the housing authority really do the job that it should. But it isn't a question of resources. And I mean, dollar amounts. They have the money. They could do development that keeps people in place. And now we got to see if we have the political will to actually make that happen. God, you know, does anyone else have another question for someone who didn't ask a question? Yeah, all right, the people who've asked. All right, so we'll go on the second round. Go ahead. Oh, yeah. All right. I don't know. I mean, the question is just Navy Yard. I showed you District Winery, right? And that whole area has redeveloped tremendously. But it's called Navy Yard because there's a naval base that's there. And what is the relationship between the naval base and the community now? I don't know. And I think that's what your question is. Yeah. And a lot of that had to do with Nats Ballpark. I mean, when Nats Ballpark developed, and then also there's a waterfront there that was redeveloped, and where District Winery is, right in front of it, it's very close to the water. There's a public park that was put there. So there was investments that were made by the city that helped that area redeveloped. So I know there's one more question in the back. Do you want to ask it, and we'll end it on your question? Great question. And thank you for the question, because you allowed me now to market my book, The Cappuccino City. So my book about Shaw U Street's redevelopment ends with the exact question and dilemma you just talked about. How do we build third spaces that bring people together across difference to realize we have more commonalities than differences, and figuring out how we can all work together to make our communities more equitable and prosperous and innovative. And I think a good example in Washington is Busboys and Poets. And I know there's a lot of controversy about Busboys and Poets, but it is a coffee shop, restaurant, bookstore, performance theater. It's in Shaw U Street. It's all over the place. Andy Shalal is the owner, and he did the first Busboys and Poets in Shaw U Street. And I feel like when you go into the Busboys and Poets, there is a vibe of inclusivity, of diversity, of social justice. It is just part of the aura and ethos of the restaurant. And the clientele that go there are very racially, ethnically diverse, age diversity, sexual orientation diversity, whatever sort of things you want to put under the diversity label, you'll see it in that restaurant. And I interviewed Andy several times for the book and asked him like how he did that. And he said, I was intentional. And I said, well, what do you mean by intentional? And he said, well, when I built the restaurant, he said, I've owned a Greek restaurant. I've owned different restaurants in Washington, D.C. When I bought this space, I didn't even have a concept of what would be in the space. I interviewed community leaders in Shaw U Street and asked them, what do they want to see in this space? And so this idea of cultural diversity and Black resistance, it all came out of the history of the Shaw U Street community, and it's been embedded within the restaurant. So, I mean, what a risk that Andy took. And I can't even believe, when you think about Busboys, I don't know if people have been in DC, you're like, wow, what a successful business owner. But at the time, this was like 2004 and 5, it was incredibly risky. Like, he wasn't just doing a restaurant, he was doing a performance theater, a bookstore. Bookstores weren't making money. So the concept was very risky in terms of a business venture, but it worked. And the other thing that he did, so he brought up this vibe of inclusivity through interviewing people in the neighborhood. He also got a government guaranteed loan. It was called the 504 SBA, Small Business Administration loan. That loan allowed him to buy the space. So most restaurants, they rent the space, right? Most small businesses, they rent the space. He bought the space. He was smart because he's not only a good restaurateur, he's also a good real estate person, because he realized this area is gentrifying. If I buy the space, even if the restaurant fails, the value in the land and the space will go up and I'll make money. Well, he got a subsidized loan, government guaranteed loan. He buys the space. The property values go up. The business is very successful. Then he starts the next Busboys off the equity of the property in the first Busboys. Then he starts the next Busboys, the next Busboys. He's got a restaurant and real estate empire. But in all of the spaces, he interviews people. He's got a space in Anacostia. He's interviewed people about the space in Anacostia. So like, he's got a place now in Baltimore. He's been asked to go to Denver with this concept. He's been asked to go into Harlem. He hasn't gone to all these places. But when he goes to these spaces, he asks people who live in these cities and communities what they want to see. And that's what's really important. So I will say a lot of people criticize him because they say he cares more about green than he does about any other color, racial or ethnic wise. He's very successful. He's made a lot of money. There's no question. but he also has gone beyond what I think most business people do in terms of thinking about how to bring people together across difference. And it's been successful in his business ventures. So how do we replicate that though? We can't just like get other Andes, right? But we can, how can foundations, how can government agencies, how can the Department of Housing and Urban Development subsidize businesses or community groups that are thinking about how to bring people together across difference? I remember I gave a talk when the Cappuccino book came out for the DC family. No, I can't remember. No, was it? I don't remember the name, but it was like 200 family foundations were brought together, and they're all DC family foundations. I said, how many of you are trying to subsidize affordable housing with your foundation? And all these hands went up. And I said, how many of you are trying to bring people together across differences in gentrified spaces throughout the city? 2 hands went up. I said, you guys got to redeploy your money, right? It's about preserving affordable housing, but also about making sure the community dynamics are right. So the people who housing you do preserve feel comfortable in these spaces. We as a government and as a foundation philanthropy world don't think about that dynamic very often. And we need to do that. So, all right, I need to go get a drink. And not coffee. I need a beer. It's Friday. Well, I just want to say thanks again to all of you for coming out. Great questions, great conversation, and I hope you have a really nice weekend here at AU. Thanks.